You need a home and I need a mommy. The words rose into the winter air, soft and fragile yet striking as a bell. They floated among the drifting snowflakes like the whisper of an angel. Elliot Monroe snapped around, startled, his cell phone still pressed against his ear. And there she was, his daughter. His only child, 4 years old, standing just a few steps away. Leia's small, mittened hands, patterned with little bears, rested tenderly on the lap of a young woman sitting hunched on the bus stop bench. The woman barely seemed real. Her slender frame was wrapped in a tattered coat that offered little protection against the bitter cold. She clutched a faded cloth tote to her chest, as if it were the last thing keeping her grounded. Snow clung to her disheveled golden hair strands, frozen into place. Her pale blue eyes blinked slowly, glazed with exhaustion like a ghost forced into flesh. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow, her hands trembling from both chill and weakness. And yet she didn't move, didn't reach out. It was Leia who reached first. With childlike certainty, the little girl placed a bear-shaped cookie gently into the woman's lap. "You can live with us," she said, her voice innocent but firm with conviction. Leia Elliot's voice sharpened as he rushed forward. He ended his call abruptly, heart-hammering, and pulled his daughter behind him with protective instinct. Dropping to one knee, he leveled a cautious gaze at the stranger. "What are you doing with my daughter?" The woman slowly raised her hands, palms open, in a gesture of surrender. Her voice rasped, hoarse from cold, yet steady. "Nothing. She just came over." Elliot narrowed his eyes. Her skin was flushed too red in unnatural places, not the rosy bloom of health, but the fevered blush of illness. A faint shiver ran through her frail body. "I didn't ask for anything," she murmured, lowering her gaze. "But thank you for having such a kind child." Something twisted inside Elliot's chest. He looked down at Leia, who was still staring with wide, trusting eyes. "Daddy, she fed the cat first," the little girl said matter-of-factly. Elliot followed her gesture. There in the snow by the bench lay half a torn loaf of bread. A thin, trembling cat pawed at the crumbs, gnawing desperately. The other half was gone, offered without hesitation by the stranger before him. Elliot's jaw tightened. She hadn't begged. She hadn't asked for help. But her silence was louder than anything he had heard all day. He squeezed his daughter's hand firmly. "Let's go," he muttered. But just as he turned to leave, the sound came, a body hitting hard against the icy ground. He spun back. The young woman had tried to rise, but her legs gave way. She struck the metal post of the bus shelter and collapsed into the snow. Daddy Leia cried, tugging at his sleeve in panic. Elliot ran to her side, heart pounding. He bent quickly, pressed 2 fingers against her neck. A pulse there, but faint. Her face was slick with sweat, burning hot, though her skin was chilled to the touch. Her lips were pale, her breathing shallow, her body trembling. This was not only hunger, this was sickness, a fever consuming what little strength she had left. No time to hesitate. Without another thought, Elliot scooped her up into his arms. She was shockingly light, almost weightless, like a shadow given form. As he lifted her, the coat fell open, revealing bruises scattered along her arms, scars etched into thin skin. She whimpered faintly against his chest, too weak to resist. "Come on, Leia," Elliot said urgently, voice tight with worry. "Daddy, is she going to die?" the little girl whispered, her voice small and frightened. "Not if we get her warm," he replied, his steps quick and sure against the crunch of frozen ground. Together they moved through the storm, a man, a child, and a stranger nearly lost to the cold. 3 figures hurrying toward the light of a porch lamp flickering in the distance. And as they neared the house, Leia's small voice broke the silence once more, quiet, yet prophetic. "I think she's our home now." Elliot said nothing. He only pushed open the door, letting the firelight spill out to meet them. Isabel stirred. The first thing she noticed was warmth, the heavy embrace of a wool blanket across her body. She opened her eyes slowly, lids heavy lashes brushing her cheeks. The room came into focus piece by piece, the golden glow of a fire crackling in the hearth, the polished wood floor gleaming faintly in the light, a tall bookshelf lined with architectural books, the faint, homely scent of cedar and cinnamon. She was lying on a long sofa, her head resting on a pillow, her tattered coat folded neatly at her feet. For a moment she couldn't remember how she'd gotten here. Just the bus stop, the snow, the little girl. A soft sound reached her ears, the scratch of crayons against paper. Turning her head, Isabel saw Laya seated cross-legged on the rug tongue, peeking out in concentration as she drew furiously. On the paper, 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, and one with a halo of yellow hair. Above them, written in shaky block letters, the words, "My Home." Isabel blinked, stunned. She tried to sit up, but pain and dizziness pulled her back down. The movement was enough to catch Laya's attention. The little girl leapt up, grinning, and hurried to her side. "You woke up!" Laya beamed proudly, holding up her drawing. "That's us!" Isabel's lips trembled as she tried to speak, her voice no more than a rasp. "Sweetheart, Daddy says you can stay until you're better," Laya said, solemnly nodding. "But I think you should stay longer." Before Isabel could respond, Elliot entered the room, his expression guarded. He set a glass of water and a small bowl of soup on the coffee table. "You passed out in the snow," he said evenly. "I didn't have a choice. You needed help. When you're better, you'll leave." His tone wasn't cruel, just measured, but the words stung all the same. Isabel lowered her eyes, whispering softly, "Thank you." Laya lingered beside her, eager to chatter, but Elliot gently took his daughter's hand. Let her rest. The day slipped by in quiet rhythm. The next morning dawned gray and heavy with snow, the kind of winter sky that seemed unwilling to let the sun through. Yet inside the Monroe home, the kitchen carried a quiet hum of life. Elliot stood at the counter stirring a pan of oatmeal, his mind already running through deadlines, drafts, and the weight of unpaid bills. He wasn't used to anyone else being in this space. It was his territory, organized, efficient, and silent. But when he turned, he found her there. Isabel. She had risen from the sofa before he had even noticed her coat now neatly folded on the armrest. Though her face was still pale, she moved with a delicate steadiness, as if each motion was an act of discipline. She had found a rag, dampened it, and was wiping crumbs from the table. "You don't have to do that," Elliot said curtly. Her hand stilled. She glanced up, her eyes catching his for only a moment before lowering again. "I need to," she replied softly. Her voice was stronger than the night before, but still frayed at the edges. Laya, perched on a stool nearby, giggled. "She's helping us, Daddy. She's like Snow White, but without the dress." Elliot's brow furrowed, but he said nothing. Isabel moved quietly through the small tasks, sweeping up ash by the hearth, folding dish towels, setting bowls in order. Not out of obligation, but with a kind of instinct, like someone who needed to give back in order to keep standing. By midday, the house already felt different. The silence was not so sharp. The air carried the faint scent of broth, simmering, something Elliot hadn't smelled in his home for years since his wife's passing. Isabel stood at the stove, carefully stirring a pot of soup, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her thin arms still bore faint bruises, but her movements were precise, almost graceful. She tasted the broth with a wooden spoon, nodded slightly to herself, and added a pinch of herbs she'd found in a jar on the shelf. Laya sat at the table with crayons, her eyes darting off into Isabel. "Is she going to stay forever, Daddy?" she asked suddenly. Elliot froze mid-step. "She's only here until she gets better," he said, sharper than he intended. The words hung in the air. Isabel kept stirring, but her shoulders tensed. When the soup was ready, she ladled it into bowls, placing one before Laya, one before Elliot, and one for herself. Elliot eyed it warily before taking a cautious spoonful. The flavor surprised him, rich, balanced, comforting. It reminded him of meals he hadn't tasted since before the weight of grief had settled on their lives. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked before he could stop himself. Isabel hesitated, then gave a faint smile. "From my mother. She said food could hold a family together even when words couldn't." Elliot looked at her more closely, then studying the way she handled herself. Despite the fragility of her frame, there was something in her, a discipline, a resilience, that didn't fit the picture of a homeless stranger. That night, after Laya had gone to bed, Elliot sat in his study, the glow of his laptop screen reflecting in his tired eyes. He couldn't shake the unease. Who was she, really? He typed her name, Isabel Hart, into the search bar. The results hit him like a blow. Headlines, old articles, a face younger, brighter, but unmistakable. Promising violinist charged with assault. Concert hall tragedy ends in scandal. Isabel Hart disappears after charges dropped. Elliot scrolled, his heart tightening with each line. There were conflicting stories. Some painted her as dangerous, unstable. Others whispered of a cover-up, of jealousy, of lies buried under the weight of money and power. But one detail was clear. She had once stood on a stage, brilliant and adored. And then she had vanished. The sound of soft footsteps pulled him back. Isabel stood at the doorway, pale in the dim light. She had seen the screen. Her voice cracked, but her eyes held steady. "You found me." Elliot shut the laptop, his expression unreadable. "I had to know who was under my roof. My daughter. She's safe with me." Isabel interrupted, her tone trembling but firm. "I would never hurt her. I would rather disappear again than cause her pain." Silence pressed between them, heavy and raw. Elliot searched her face, looking for deception, but all he saw was exhaustion and a strange kind of truth. Finally, Isabel whispered almost to herself, "I used to believe music could save me, but when the world turned against me, I stopped believing in anything." Her hands clenched at her sides, thin fingers trembling. Then, with quiet dignity, she turned and walked back toward the living room, her shadow retreating into the firelight. Elliot sat frozen in his chair, the headline still echoing in his mind. He had taken in a stranger, but not just any stranger, a woman with a past loud enough to drown out the rest of her life. And yet, his daughter adored her. The questions clawed at him long into the night. The house grew quieter in the days that followed. Not the comfortable quiet that comes from peace, but the strained kind that cracks at the edges. Elliot carried the knowledge of Isabel's past like a stone in his chest. He tried to bury it under routine packing, Laya's lunch finishing projects, answering calls, but whenever Isabel entered the room, the headlines replayed in his mind. Isabel felt it too. She had always been sensitive to shifts in air, to pauses too long, to gazes that carried doubt. Elliot was kind enough, but the warmth in his voice had cooled, and silence stretched wider between them. She moved through the kitchen, carefully folding napkins, cooking meals, tucking Laya's hair behind her ear. She did everything as before, but now with the quiet fear of a guest who had overstayed her welcome. One evening, Laya came bounding into the living room, clutching a paper star she had cut out herself. "It's for you, Mommy," she said, placing it in Isabel's hands with unshakable conviction. The word pierced her. Isabel pressed the star to her chest, her throat aching with the sweetness and the cruelty of it. She smiled for Laya's sake, kissed her forehead, and tucked her into bed. But later that night, when the house was still, she sat alone by the window, the star in her lap, tears sliding silently down her face. She thought of the violin she hadn't touched in years, of the stage lights that once blinded her, of the betrayal that had left her nameless and wandering. She thought of this house, warm, full of laughter, not her own, but laughter that had let her breathe again. And she thought of the little girl who had called her Mommy without hesitation. Isabel knew what she had to do. The next morning, Elliot entered the kitchen to find a folded envelope on the table. His name was written on the front in delicate looping script. He picked it up with a dread already filling his chest. Inside was a letter. "Elliot, I never meant to stay. You opened your door when I had nowhere left to go, and you gave me something I thought I had lost forever: safety. Laya gave me something even greater, love, without question. For that, I will never stop being grateful. But I cannot be the shadow in your house, the question mark in your daughter's life. She deserves a mother who is not broken by the past, who is not haunted by mistakes she did not choose but still carries. I wanted to believe I could be that for her, for you, but hope alone is not enough. So I am leaving before my presence becomes a wound instead of a balm. Please tell Laya that I love her, though I have no right to. Tell her she gave me a gift I will carry into whatever tomorrow brings, that I was seen again. You once told me I wasn't invisible. Please remember that neither are you. Don't disappear into grief the way I once did. She needs you, and perhaps someday, when time has softened these jagged edges, you'll both remember me kindly. With all that, I am Isabel." The paper trembled in his hands as he finished reading. Elliot sat heavily at the table, unable to move, unable to breathe. The words cut into him, not with anger, but with loss so sharp. It felt like betrayal. "Daddy." He turned. Laya stood in the doorway, her hair rumpled from sleep, clutching the stuffed bear Isabel had mended for her. Her eyes searched the room. "Where's Mommy?" Elliot's throat closed. He couldn't answer. He pulled her into his arms, instead, holding her tightly as she began to cry. "She promised," Laya whispered against his chest. "She promised." Elliot kissed the top of her head, tears burning his own eyes. He rocked her gently, whispering over and over, "I know, baby. I know." Days passed in a blur. The house felt hollow again, too quiet, the air heavy with the absence of her laughter. Her songs, her soup that had once made even winter feel warm. Elliot moved through the motions, but each time Laya looked at him with those pleading eyes, the wound opened wider. And yet, life did not stop. Snow melted, days lengthened. On some evenings, Laya would sit by the window with her paper stars whispering to them as if they could carry her words to Isabel. Elliot, watching from the doorway, realized that despite the hurt his daughter still believed, it was a fragile thread of hope, and it kept them both breathing. The auditorium was hushed, the kind of silence that trembles before something sacred. On stage, Laya stood small yet steady, her paper trembling in her hands. She lifted her chin, glanced once at Isabel sitting in the crowd, and began to read. She had cold hands, but a warm heart, and she didn't laugh at me when I called her Mommy. The words slipped into the room like a prayer. A few gasps broke the stillness, followed by silence again, this time heavy, reverent. Isabel's breath caught. Her chest tightened. She didn't stay long, but she left pieces of herself with us like songs and hugs and soup that tastes like love. Isabel covered her mouth, tears spilling despite her effort to hold them back. Laya's voice trembled but did not stop. "Home is not the walls around me, or the pillows on my bed. Home is when she sang to me and kissed my sleepy head. Home is where my daddy smiles and holds her hand so tight. Home is where my mommy is. And maybe that is tonight." The last line fell like a bell tolling in the air. The applause that followed was soft, almost hesitant, as though the audience was afraid to disturb the fragile holiness of the moment. Isabel barely felt the crowd around her as she rose slowly, moving toward the stage. Her heart pounded in her ears, and then she saw him, Elliot, emerging quietly from the side of the room carrying something in his hands. It was a wooden frame. Inside it, behind clear glass, lay the silk scarf Isabel had once wrapped around Laya on that first snowy night. The scarf had carried warmth, yes, but more than that, it had carried the moment everything began to change. Elliot stopped before her, holding it out. His eyes glistened, his voice low. "I framed the day I met you," he said. "That's when home returned." The words pierced her more deeply than any letter, any memory. She stared at the scarf, then at him. Her voice was scarcely more than a whisper. "I thought I left too much damage behind to ever deserve a future, and I thought keeping people away would protect what little I had left." Elliot replied, his voice rough. "But it turns out letting you in gave us more." Her lip trembled. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat, fingers brushing against something she had carried all this time. She pulled out a folded slip of paper, edges worn soft. Elliot recognized it instantly, the note he had left beside her teacup that first night. "You're not invisible," it read. Isabel's hand shook as she held it out. "You were the first to see me again. Not the headlines, not the mistakes, just me." He stepped closer. "Then let me see all of you, without fear, without running." Isabel's gaze shifted toward the stage, where Laya waited, her eyes wide, her face glowing with hope. Isabel's voice cracked as she whispered, "Then I think I'd like to come home." The words broke the dam. Laya leapt from the stage, barreling into Isabel's arms, her laughter ringing out like music. Isabel held her tightly, burying her face in her daughter's hair, breathing in the impossible sweetness of belonging. The crowd erupted not with the shallow applause of fashion or fame, but with the kind reserved for something rare, witnessing family being found not by blood, but by choice. The morning light spilled gently through the kitchen window, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. A gentle sizzle echoed from the counter where Laya stood proudly on a small step stool. Her little hands pressed a cookie cutter into the soft sheet of dough, lifting out perfect shapes. Isabel stood beside her sleeves, rolled up flour dusting her cheeks like powdered snow. "Don't forget the hearts." Laya said, her tone serious, as though shaping love into dough was the most important task in the world. "Of course," Isabel replied with a soft smile. "How could I forget the most important shape?" From the doorway, Elliot leaned against the frame, arms crossed quietly, watching the two girls, one his daughter by blood, the other now by heart. For the first time in years, there was no tension, no wondering, no fear. Only ease, only presence. The pieces of a once broken puzzle had finally clicked into place. He stepped forward, laying his hands gently across their backs, then pressed a kiss to the crown of Laya's head and then Isabel's. His voice was low, filled with a warmth that shook even him. "You know," he murmured, "this is the first morning in years I haven't woken up feeling like something was missing." Isabel looked up at him, her eyes soft, unguarded. On the counter nearby lay a small card, handwritten in delicate script. Elliot picked it up and read silently. "Let's learn to stay, Isabel." His throat tightened. This house, once so silent and sterile, was alive again, not with music from speakers or guests, but with the laughter of a child and the clatter of spoons. Later that morning, Elliot led them down the hallway, stopping before a door they had passed many times, but never opened. He paused, then turned the knob. Inside was a sunlit studio. A large drafting table sat by the window. Spools of fabric lined one wall, while a mood board of blank sketches and pinned color swatches waited. On the wall hung a small plaque freshly mounted, "Isabel's Tomorrow, a place to begin again." Isabel froze in the doorway, her breath catching. "I wanted to give you a place where your hands could create again," Elliot said softly. "A place where your dreams could be bigger than your fears." She stepped inside, running her fingers across the smooth edge of the table, then the softness of the linen bolts. Her eyes glistened with tears, but behind them was something new, a light that had been buried too long. "I never imagined anyone would build a room for me," she whispered. Elliot's reply came steady, sure. "You built something in us first. This is just giving back the foundation." Just then, from the kitchen came a shout, bright and unmistakable. "Let's make pancakes, Mommy and Daddy." The two adults laughed, the kind of laughter that only comes when the heart has finally settled. Elliot reached for Isabel's hand. She took it, her grip sure. Together they returned to the kitchen, where the table was set with mismatched plates, a small mountain of cookies, and a tilted jug of orange juice resting on a tea towel. Leia stood over the stove, carefully pouring syrup into a smiley-face pancake mold. "This one's for Mommy," she announced proudly. They sat together, the room swelling with the scent of cinnamon and vanilla. Isabel glanced around, then reached into her pocket. She unfolded a small faded handkerchief, one she and Leia had been practicing embroidery on. Below the old floral stitching, a new line had been added in tender thread. "Family is not built by blood, but by the hands that hold when you're lost." She placed it gently in the center of the table. Elliot stared at it for a long moment, then reached out his thumb, brushing over the final word. His voice caught. "You held us both when we didn't even know we needed it." Isabel looked between the two of them, this man who had learned to love again, and this child who had chosen love from the very beginning. Her smile held no hesitation this time, only certainty. They had not found perfection, but they had found home. And sometimes that was the far greater miracle. Sometimes the family you find is the family that finds you first. A little girl's innocent words, a man's silent grief, and a woman who thought she had nothing left to give together, they had built something no storm could ever take away. Not a flawless life, but a real one. A home not born of walls, but of hands that held on. If this story stirred something in your heart, give it a like, so we know you still believe in the miracles of love and family. Don't forget to subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more tales that heal the soul and remind you that tomorrow is always a gift. And share with us in the comments, do you believe family is born or found? We'd love to hear your answer straight from the heart.